Yes, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2050 Rural and Human Service Transportation Plans Regional Workshop, focusing on the Atlanta region. My name is Matthew Wilson. I serve as the Mobility Manager for the Georgia Department of Transportation and as the Project Manager for this plan. And I want to thank you all for attending this morning. Just a few virtual meeting housekeeping items. First, we ask that you please keep your mic on mute during the presentation. This ensures that everyone is able to hear the presentation clearly. For those using a computer or smartphone, this is the microphone icon with a slash through it. For those on the phone, we ask that you please use the mute button on your phone. As we progress through the presentation today, we have a few scheduled breaks for questions and discussion. Please ask or provide comment. This workshop is designed for us to better understand rural and human service transportation in your region, and your active participation is encouraged. When asking a question or making a comment during these times, please use the raise hand feature in Teams. This is the icon with the smiley face and hand. Alternatively, you can use the chat box feature to type in your question, which is in the comment bubble icon. Our team member Jaquita will be monitoring the hand raises and chat box during the entire workshop. A little bit about the RTST team. The 2050 Rural and Human Services Transportation Plan is a 3-agency plan. I will speak more about this in the coming slides. The Georgia Departments of Transportation, Human Services, and Community Health are the plan sponsors. The plan is being developed with the help of a consultant team comprised of AECOM, Cambridge Systematics, and Modern Mobility Partners. Today, we're going to run through the following topics. I will provide a brief introduction and some background on rural and human service transportation in Georgia. I will then hand it off to Will Brewer from AECOM to review the available transit and transportation services in the Atlanta region. After, Baird Bream from Cambridge Systematics will walk us through the region's transit needs. And then Kirsten Moat from Modern Mobility Partners will guide our discussion session. And we also have a couple question and discussion points throughout the workshop. So what exactly is rural and human service transportation? Not many people may be familiar with the terms. Rural and Human Service Transportation, or RHST, are mobility services provided for the benefit of disadvantaged populations, including persons with disabilities, older adults, and persons without a vehicle. RHST includes services provided by public transit operators, human service agencies, private providers, and private nonprofit agencies. This 2050 RHST plan seeks to do a few things. First, we're going to do a general update of the existing conditions information from the previous plan, and then we're going to build upon the recommendations and efforts completed from that first plan to identify projects, programs, and policies to meet current and future out to 2050 demands and provide enhancements to RHST across Georgia. As I mentioned, this plan is a 3-agency plan. This is because the state of Georgia administers 3 systems to provide public transit, human services transportation, and non-emergency medical transportation, NEMT, services. Each system is administered by a different state agency using different funding sources. GDOT focuses on public transit for rural and small urban populations. DHS focuses on transportation services for seniors, low-income families, individuals with disabilities, and vocational training, while DCH focuses on transportation to medically necessary services for eligible Medicaid members. Coordination exists at the state, regional, and local levels. However, each agency's system operates independently using a variety of service delivery models with differing requirements. The state's role in governing transit is primarily to oversee compliance with federal grant requirements. There is no single state authority to set priorities for public transit and human service transportation, or to coordinate planning and funding of transit services for rural communities. A little bit of history on the RHST plan. Back in 2007, the Georgia Departments of Human Services and Transportation completed the Coordinated Public Transit Human Services Transportation Plan. As an update to the plan, GDOT initiated the Georgia Rural and Human Services Transportation Plan 2.0 in 2011. The RHST Plan 2.0 outlined coordination activities among the rural public and human services transportation providers across the state to achieve improved service delivery for the state's public transportation and human services transportation customers. The plan also developed recommendations to implement mobility management at the state and regional level. In 2001, GDOT, DHS, and DCH began developing an update, the 2050 Georgia RHST plan. The purpose of this plan is to provide a framework for additional coordination among Georgia's agencies impacted by mobility services and continue the work of the Technical Coordinating Group, which is now renamed the Technical Advisory Group, and expand its participation to additional stakeholders. A quick look at our plan schedule. You can see we've wrapped up our vision and goals, which I will discuss on the next slide, and are heavy into our existing conditions and needs assessment, and also beginning our alternatives analysis. What I want to focus on today is how to get people involved in this process and how we can get input from your region to help us understand your needs and develop solutions. The stars on the schedule indicate stakeholder and public outreach events. Those with the pink circle indicate the Technical Advisory Group meetings. Outreach is a key component of the RHST plan update and ensures the agencies updating the plan fully understand the rural and human service transportation needs across the state. The Technical Advisory Group, which includes the 3 state agencies sponsoring the plan, also includes representatives from regional commissions, the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia, and other stakeholders. I'm pleased to see a few of them attending the workshop this morning. We are engaging stakeholders and the public in each of the 12 regions in Georgia through these regional workshops. We are also conducting a statewide survey for RHST providers and a separate survey for riders, the link to which is on the QR code on the slide. These efforts will provide all Georgians an opportunity to assess the status of the RHST plan update and identify key needs and service coordination strategies. Additionally, public feedback will be elicited through the 30-day public review and comment period for the draft RHST plan update, which we are targeting for July. The RHST vision and goals are structured from the statewide transit plan, which was developed in 2020. Our vision statement outlines where we would like rural and human service transportation to be in 2050, which is to continue and grow statewide rural and human service transportation coordination to improve the quality of life and economic activities for all Georgians, specifically those in rural areas, those with disabilities, older adults, and persons without vehicles. Our 6 goals, again based on the statewide transit plan, outline how we seek to implement the vision. The first goal is to provide coordinated and efficient rural and human services transportation. The second is to provide a safe and sustainable RHST network. Third is to optimize public transit programs to best meet public transit system needs and traveler needs. The fourth is to ensure public transit coverage across the state to support mobility and access for all. The fifth is to connect rural transit to regional and urban centers. And finally, the sixth is to leverage technology and innovation to support public transit ridership and performance. I would now like to hand it over to Will Brewer to walk us through the available transit in the Atlanta region. Will?
Great. Thank you, Matt, and good morning, everyone. As Matt mentioned, my name is Will Brewer, transportation planner with the AECOM team. And I just want to quickly go through a few maps with you all and show you some of the data that we have on existing public transit, DHS services, and Department of Community Health services. So you can see our 3 maps right here. These are going to be something that we're showing at all of the regional workshops. So I'm just going to briefly give you a snapshot of the Atlanta Regional Commission. Clearly, the Atlanta, ARC is primarily urban, so I don't really want to focus too much on the first visualization that you see there. I will acknowledge that, all counties do fall within that GRTA 13 county service area boundary. So we really want to focus more on DHS and DCH services. There are a few divisions and agencies involved with DHS on providing these services on that center map that you see here. That'd be Division of Aging, Division of Family and Children Services, and Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. Now, we will come back and revisit these maps, but for those of you that do have a visualization in front of you, it'd be great if you could just take a look at this and see where your service areas are available in these counties in this region. We'd like to get your feedback and see what's missing or if everything looks correct. or any other comments that you may have. The next visualization here, we have our non-emergency medical through DHS. There are two brokers that operate in 5 different regions across the state. For ARC, we have Southeast Trans broker in the North region, Southeast Trans in the Atlanta region, and Motive Care in the Central region. Kind of a split between 3 different regions and with these different brokers. So just something to pay attention to. And I will acknowledge, going back to Department of Human Services, we have one county for site that has other. And so I'd like to get some feedback on what that may be. It could be another division or department that we're not aware of. But just to show you a snapshot, existing conditions of public transit and services. And so I'm going to hand it over to Kirsten, and maybe we can get some feedback and questions.
Thanks, Will. So, as Will mentioned, we want to ensure that we are reflecting the most accurate information available, especially when you get to human services coordination. As you saw in the map, there's a lot of variation about which services are available in which of the counties. So what we would like to do is to do a little polling with you guys and get some feedback. So if you are on a computer or have a smartphone available, you can go to www.menti.com. And when you get there, you can enter this 8-digit code. And I'm going to do the same thing on my phone. So it is 27625637. And you hit submit, and you'll see a window pop up that says instructions. Alternatively, you can use the QR code on the right side of your screen. So we just have a couple questions. The first one is, what transportation systems are we missing? And I will go back here in just a second to the maps. But what we're looking for is, are there transportation services being provided in the Atlanta region that we are not reflecting in these maps? Maybe it's a private transportation company that's offering services with some sort of fee. Maybe it's a church or a group of churches that are providing transportation services to seniors or other groups of people, and they just do it out of their own funding. It's those types of services that we're looking for. So again, what are we missing here? Are there any transportation services that you are aware of that we need to be aware of as we're doing this needs assessment and existing conditions? So again, as you're thinking through that on the DHS services, you can see in DeKalb, there's services for aging and family and child services, but not for the behavioral health and developmental disabilities. All 3 services are available in Cherokee, Fulton, Gwinnett, and Henry. In Fayette County, there's no family and child services. And then in Douglas, Clayton, and Rockdale, there's only family and child services, no aging or developmental behavioral health and developmental disabilities. So give you a second to kind of think about that, take a look at the map. Go back, see if we have anything. We don't yet. Give it just another second. And maybe we've covered everything. I think, again, what Will mentioned is in the Atlanta region, this region is covered by the Atlanta Region Transit Link Authority. All of the service is urban. And so, as a part of this study, since we're focusing on rural and human services, we think that there is, we want to focus more on the human services side for the Atlanta region. So we do have one comment that Douglas County has 5310 funding through Douglas Connect. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. So in your experience with transit, and this can include the urban transit as well. I think it would be good to have that information. But what do you feel are some of the constraints that are working against the existing systems? Are there constraints on funding? I think that's usually a pretty big one. But as far as the services go, are there transit providers that are finding that they can't fulfill certain days of the week or hours of the day that they would like to? Perhaps it's not being able to carry all of the human services divisions in a county. Um, Maybe some of the constraints are on the operational side. Maybe transit providers are dealing with labor shortages, whether they're drivers or mechanics or front of the office staff doing the scheduling. Maybe there's not enough vehicles, or maybe the vehicles are old. So we're looking for any type of constraints that you're aware of on any of the existing systems. So we've got staffing. Drivers have become a big issue. There are more calls for demand response as folks are returning to doctor's appointments. I think that's really good. We've heard that. So is it just staffing, or are we also finding that we don't have enough vehicles to respond to all those demand response trips? I think across the state and, especially in the metro Atlanta region, COVID-19 has had a major impact on transit services, and Baird's going to talk a little bit about those trends that we've heard from some of the survey responses. Okay, good. Not enough funding to meet demand. I think pre-COVID, demand was really high. Now it seems that ridership has gone down significantly for a lot of transit providers, but maybe not on the human services side, right? Maybe that's more just on the public transit side, as people are going back to the doctors and are making more trips for shopping and services. And then, of course, there are people that rely on the non-emergency medical transportation to get to dialysis appointments, for example. They could never stop those even during COVID. Still the issue of using transportation to deliver meals. I don't know who provided that comment, but if you are able to unmute yourself, do you mind giving a little more detail on that?
Yeah, this is Connie White from the Atlanta Regional Commission. And there are a lot of senior centers in the region, namely, like, say, DeKalb, Rockdale, that have not yet opened, right? So they are still delivering meals to individuals at home and doing virtual programming. And as the variants have come and gone, other major counties, such as Fulton, are having to pull back their reentry into senior centers. And so they're having to redivert again to deliver meals at home to individuals who are in need of that meal. So there's a competition almost in 20, where all the transit funds were almost diverted towards delivering meals because people weren't riding, to now people are riding, but you're still having to use part of your transportation to deliver meals. So there's like a competition for the need.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Connie.
Mhm.
Okay, well, this is great feedback. And like I said, we just had a couple questions trying to break it up. But we're gonna have more questions for you a little bit later, and that'll be discussion based. So we're done with the Mentimeter. We just want to get a couple polls in there. And like I said, there's still plenty of time for questions and comments. So if you think of something, either a question or a comment, please feel free to use the chat box feature or the raise hand feature. And then when we get to the next discussion point, we'll ask anybody who would like to speak. You're welcome to unmute your mic and speak, especially for anybody who's on the phone that doesn't have access to the chat or the raise hand feature. So I'm going to turn it over to Baird with Cambridge Systematics, and he's going to talk more about the needs assessment and some of the data that we've been collecting over the past several months.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the intro, Kirsten. As she said, this is the needs assessment overview of the rural and human services transportation demand in the Atlanta Regional Commission. So the needs assessment is an effort to identify needs and priorities for RHST in the region using a combination of quantitative and qualitative analyses. The needs assessment methodology was designed to be consistent with the needs assessment methodology that GDOT used previously for its statewide transit plan, which was conducted in 2019 and 2020. And what we've done is update the analysis based on 2019 data. And I'll explain why we're using 2019 data on the next slide when we introduce the two methodologies for calculating transit demand. Next slide, please. So the needs assessment is calculated from two types of demand assessment, a non-program demand assessment and a mobility gap demand assessment. The non-program demand results are shown here in blue, and the mobility gap demand assessment results are shown in green. Both of these rely on demographic information in the region taken from the county level to capture transit demand. The non-program demand assessment is based purely on demographic information among transit-dependent or transit-reliant populations. So people ages 60 and older, people with disabilities, and the residents of zero-vehicle households, by which we mean households in which the residents do not have consistent and reliable access to a private vehicle. The mobility gap demand assessment is a little bit different. It focuses more on travel behavior rather than demographics alone, where the estimate of transit demand is based on the difference in person trips between a one-vehicle household and a zero-vehicle household. So essentially, the mobility gap demand assessment methodology attempts to estimate how many trips people aren't able to take due to their lack of access to a vehicle as compared to essentially their neighbors or their peers in households that do have one vehicle. The data for both of these is taken from the ACS, the American Community Survey, that's produced on an annual basis by the U.S. Census. The most recent data that's available for review and analysis is from 2019 due to the necessary just data review and cleaning and production processes that the census undertakes for its data. So again, we're using 2019 as our base year and 2050 as our horizon year to estimate demand in the future. Now, what this table shows is the demand specifically for rural and human services transportation. So while it's looking across the entirety of the Atlanta region, it's focusing on the transit services and the demand needed specifically within those rural areas. So we're discounting, the city of Atlanta and a lot of the surrounding suburbs, and instead focusing on the rural areas. So what we see is that those rural transit providers together provided about 108,000 trips in 2019. And that again represents kind of total available transit service consumption. What the estimates show is that in 2019, there were really only about 76,000 trips demanded based on demographic profiles under the non-program demand, and about 137,000 trips demanded under the mobility gap demand assessment. So what this means is that under the current operating conditions, the Atlanta region is meeting all demand under the non-program demand assessment, but has a gap of about 29,000 trips under the mobility gap demand assessment. Now, there is a cost to meeting this 100% of demand, which we present here as both the capital and operating costs. And in 2019, this totaled about $1.5 million, which essentially represents the existing operating costs of rural transit providers within the region. And then the mobility gap demand assessment indicates that a total of 2.9 million would be necessary to meet 100% of that existing demand. Because this area is projected to grow, it's projected to add population, we do see rural demand increase in 2050 under both the non-program demand and mobility gap demand assessments. And I'll just pause for a moment to say that those projections of population growth are taken from the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, which produces annual population estimates at a county level for all counties in Georgia through 2065. And under those estimates, we see that rural transit demand under the non-program under the non-program demand assessment grows to about 138,000 in 2050, and under the mobility gap demand assessment, it grows to about 248,000 trips. And as a result, the total annual cost to meet 100% of that rural transit demand increases to $3 million under the non-program demand assessment and $5.1 million under the mobility gap demand assessment. And just to emphasize there, that total annual cost represents a kind of maximal approach to this lower bound and upper bound, where we're trying to meet 100% of that demand. That isn't necessarily the recommendation of this study that the rural transit agencies in the Atlanta region do so. It just shows what would be necessary in order to do so. Next slide, please. This takes a slightly different approach to estimating transit demand. It's the kind of the third methodology that we use, which is to estimate specifically commuter transit demand assessment. So while the previous methodologies looked at kind of all the different types of transit service needed kind of within a county or within a community, this specifically looks at trips that cross county lines, kind of recognizing the different economic dynamics that exist between counties, where people may live in one county but want to work in another. And the way this calculation is produced is by looking at the number of home-based work trips as estimated by the GDOT travel demand model and another census database, because home-based work trips are taken as kind of a proxy for transit demand in this analysis, where home-based work trips represent a work commute that is not being met by another type of transportation, but could serve as a source of that transit demand. Now, while we recognize that there are going to be a lot of inter-county dynamics, a lot of people live in one county and work in another, we focus on annual commuter transit demand that totals or exceeds 100,000 trips per year. That's because we see 100,000 trips as kind of a minimum level of annual demand that's necessary to justify the capital and operating costs of that commuter transit. So what we see here is that there are numerous intercounty travel patterns that exceed that threshold. There's actually a second slide that we'll look at as well, that shows again an additional set of intercounty transit. So what we see here is that there's pretty robust demand that in most circumstances grows from between 2019 and 2050 as a result of population and demographic growth that in many cases exceeds several million trips per year. So from Cherokee to Cobb, Fulton to Cobb, and Douglas to Cobb, you see transit demand that totals nearly 10 million trips going from each of those counties into Cobb. But then we also have demand from Henry into Clayton, totaling about 800,000 trips in 2019, and Henry to DeKalb County, totaling 450,000. And again, all of these areas of demand with the increase between 2019 and 2050, with the exception of Fulton to Cobb, which experiences a slight decrease into 2050. But again, you still see this growing demand throughout the region for commuter transit trips. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see an additional set of demand. Again, still pretty robust with through connecting different counties throughout the region, including Fayette to Clayton, Fulton to Gwinnett and to Forsyth, Gwinnett back to Hall, Clayton to Fayette, and Cobb to Cherokee. And again, this shows pretty robust demand that increases for most of these counties between 2019 and 2050. The only exceptions are Fayette to Clayton and Fulton to Forsyth, which show slight decreases in demand going into 2050, but still pretty robust. Again, what we're seeing is an overall environment of pretty high demand for commuter transit service. Next slide, please. We want to transition now from our quantitative assessment to our qualitative assessment and talk a bit about the two surveys that we've been using to gather information. We're using a provider survey and a rider survey to capture input on needs and priorities directly from our stakeholders. The provider survey has been sent, directly to rural and human services transportation providers to ask for input on challenges and priorities, as well as just background information. And then we also have a rider survey, which is open to the general public to ask for input on those needs and priorities from the perspective of a current or a potential rider. So in the provider survey, so far we've seen 36 responses to date. If you have taken this survey, we thank you for your participation. If you have not, the survey is still open. It will be open through the end of the month, and we encourage you to take the survey. Additionally, we encourage you to share the survey with your peers and colleagues. So what we've seen so far in these responses for the provider survey is that fewer than 50% of respondents are able to carry riders to destinations outside jurisdictional boundaries. So there seems to be some challenges with providing that coordinated or regional service. That's affirmed by our additional survey responses that show by a 2-to-1 ratio, respondents haven't pursued coordinated human services transit or regional transit service. And again, that might be for administrative challenges, internal capacity. We understand a lot of these service providers are smaller, and so are trying to manage a full transit service with a smaller staff. We're also seeing some impacts of COVID-19 on transit service provision, where many agencies reported less ridership in 2020 than in 2019. Specifically, 6 respondents had fewer than 5,000 trips in 2019, but this increased to 10 for 2020. So again, we're probably dealing with a more challenging environment where travel behavior was disrupted, people lost jobs, people lost the opportunities to travel, and so we're trying to figure out how to best position those agencies to recover some of that lost demand or lost service capacity. We did ask agencies to indicate what sort of technologies they're considering, And the response here, or I'm sorry, considering or using actively. And the most interesting response here was that while 2 respondents indicate that they currently use a smartphone app or website for trip planning and fare payment, 8 agencies are considering adopting this tool. So we're seeing a kind of shift towards a more technology informed or technology centric environment for providing service to their customers. We also asked for the most common state of good repair need, and the responses here were both pretty standard, with the top response being purchasing new vehicles, which is a classic response for state of good repair. But the second highest need is establishing regular maintenance schedules, where some of the respondents indicated that they coordinate maintenance services with either other transit providers or other community facilities within their region. And so they don't get to schedule their maintenance exactly when they want to, but when these maintenance workers are available, which again may speak to that COVID challenge of the workforce impacts and the diminished workforce available, which is further affirmed when we get into questions around the most significant challenges that transit providers are facing, where we ask for feedback on administrative, rider demand, and funding challenges. And again, what we hear as the most significant administrative challenges is attracting and retaining qualified personnel, which again speaks to those COVID-related workforce impacts, where a lot of people have lost their jobs, left their jobs, or unfortunately, the loss of human life may have meant that a lot of jobs are no longer filled. So there's challenges both with getting drivers and mechanics into the services to maintain that quality of service. However, the other administrative challenge is a little bit more traditional, the compliance with state and federal reporting. We got some open-ended feedback from survey providers, or I'm sorry, from transit providers, that they struggle to meet the document requirements for GDOT and for the Federal Transit Administration, which again is a pretty classic challenge with rural and human services transit. Again, these are smaller agencies that still have to meet kind of the full administrative burdens, even if they're reduced reporters or have reduced reporting requirements under the National Transit Database. The rider demand and satisfaction responses were pretty interesting, because we saw, again, a more classic response, which is expanding service into new markets and ensuring that transit service is going to where people need to go and want to go. But the other is dealing with the public perception of transit, which again, we see as a potential issue attributable to COVID-19, when people started worrying about the safety of transit and the safety of being in an enclosed environment with a lot of other people. Something that felt pretty normal to them may now no longer feel safe. And so again, we're trying to be cognizant of the challenges that these agencies are facing as they recover from COVID and move into kind of the post-COVID life, recognizing that they might have to overcome this reticence or reluctance to use transit among the community. Next slide, please. Pivoting to the rider survey, we definitely saw some findings here that seem to overlap with some of the conclusions we're drawing about the provider survey results. On the rider survey, we've received 55 responses to date. Again, we're pleased with that level of response, but we're certainly looking to increase that number. And so we encourage you to share the survey among your constituents, friends and family even do. Everyone can ride transit. And what we've seen so far in the responses is that 85% of respondents do not currently ride transit. We're surprised to see that. That's certainly a higher percentage than we were expecting, but there's still a lot of value to it, because since we ask for responses about why people don't ride transit, capturing that response, capturing that insight from them is extremely valuable to understanding what sort of challenges we're up against. Among those who do ride transit, their main reason for riding is that they lack access to a vehicle, and their most common trip purposes are work, medical appointments, and dialysis appointments, which speak to the diversity of needs that rural and human services transportation is meeting in these communities. Respondents did indicate that if transit were not available and they had to find an alternative, they would likely get a ride from a friend or a family member. Again, that's pretty consistent with the literature, with what we understand about the role that human services transportation plays. People will try to tap their social networks to get the mobility that they need, but it might not be as consistent, reliable, or as simple and straightforward as having human services transit readily available in their communities. So it definitely speaks to the critical role that these services play. Among those who do not ride transit, their most common reasons for doing so are that they are interested, but transit is not convenient, or they simply are not interested, which again speaks to some of that public perception issues that we heard from the providers. The most frequently selected challenges for using that rural and human services transit is that it is not reliable enough for time-sensitive trips, like those dialysis appointments. Transit does not go to where they need to go, which again overlaps with some of the comments we heard from the providers about the challenges of expanding into new markets, and that the distance to the nearest transit service is too far, suggesting some gaps in that critical first and last mile service provision. When we ask respondents to indicate their priorities for different transit improvements to prioritize, we hear that they want to ensure that transit is providing access to jobs, providing access to healthcare, and connecting different parts of the community or region, which again may speak to some of those challenges we heard from the providers survey about the inability or the lack of pursuit of that coordinated human services transportation or regional transit service, where agencies haven't been able to improve connectivity throughout the region, but there is demand for it from their public. Finally, we asked the rider survey respondents to indicate their priority transit technologies, and what we heard was a demand for real-time arrival information at transit stops, as well as real-time arrival information via smartphone, website, and text. So again, they want information that can help them understand the reliability of their transit and plan their trips around transit more effectively. And that concludes the survey results and the needs assessment.
Well, thank you, Baird. We appreciate it. And now we're going to move into more of the discussion portion of this workshop. So just as a reminder, if you are joining us through Teams, please use the raise hand button and Chiquita will call on you. You may also enter your questions or comments into the chat box. And if you are calling in by a phone, you may unmute your mic and just speak up whenever you have a question or a comment. So first, I just kind of want to open it up. Are there any questions about the content that was presented today? I know there were a lot of numbers, especially for this region and the commute patterns in Metro Atlanta. So any general questions that anybody has about what Baird was presenting? Hearing none. Okay. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, Jordan.
Hi, yeah. Hi, everybody. One thing that I'm finding that I think would be beneficial is if we got like a directory for all the available services. Is that already available? I know we have the interactive map, but that is specifically for 5310s. Is there a way that we could get like a directory of all three of the providers? And then I'm wondering if within the survey, another reason that they don't, that they say they wouldn't utilize transit, and I don't know if this is something that's already been considered, but the cost of using privatized transit that's accessible is substantially higher than, like, say, another method such as Uber and Lyft. And Uber and Lyft are not accessible options for individuals in wheelchairs.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if that is factored in, because I know, like, for example, to rent a wheelchair accessible vehicle is sometimes $170 a day. So that cost is astronomical for riders, especially within the disability populations.
Yeah, so thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it. As far as the directory of available services, I do know that we have a lot of contact information for the transit providers. I like the suggestion of maybe as a part of this study, kind of compiling something that has all that information. So we'll go back and Matt, perhaps we can talk through that a little bit about what that looks like, and have something that can be provided to
Yes,
all of the
absolutely.
regional regions. Mhm.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much, Jordan, for that, for those comments. As that was something we want to work towards, is to having a standalone source for this type of information for people to understand what services are available to them. So working with DHS and DCH to get this information updated. Also, because there are so many different service delivery models for each of the three agencies, there are different types of operators that conduct this service. So getting all of them together in one place would be extremely helpful. That's a really good point.
Mhm. And then I appreciate your comment about the cost of using privatized transit being substantially higher than something like Uber and Lyft. We do actually have a question about that, about the cost of transportation, and if that's preventing people from being able to utilize some of the transportation. So that's a great comment, and definitely something we want to look into. So, on this slide, I just have a couple general questions about service area and connections, and thinking about the Atlanta metro regions. Are you aware of any other needs that we haven't already discussed in Metro Atlanta? And also, are there any missing connections, like service that needs to be provided but isn't being provided either within the Atlanta metro region or between ARC and maybe another region in the state? I think, as you're thinking about that, um, what I thought about when Baird was presenting the commuter transit demand between the counties is I think about the commuter services that are available, and many times they're not wheelchair accessible, but they do provide those commuter services. And so many of them are from outlying counties into Fulton County and specifically into the city of Atlanta. But what I saw is there's a lot of transit demand between other counties. A couple that kind of stood out to me were like Cherokee into Cobb County. I'm not sure that the express buses that exist today are making a stop in Cobb County, or if they're just going straight from Cherokee County to Atlanta, which I think is the case. Also saw the cab to Gwinnett. So I think those are some interesting numbers. And I know that the ATL, the Atlanta Region Transit Link Authority, is working on their 2022 Atlanta Region Transit Plan, and I know that they were doing a gap analysis as well. So I think it would be wise for us to kind of compare notes with the team that is doing that and seeing if our needs assessment is similar in nature. But back to you guys. Um, any other connections that you're hearing are needed in this region or between Atlanta and other regions? Okay. Keep thinking about it. And also, I just want to remind everybody that This recording is going to be available on the GDOT Transit website, as well as a copy of the presentation. And you can also submit questions and comments either to Matt or myself. Our contact information is going to be on the last slide, between now and March 4th. So if you think of something or have like an aha moment, feel free to reach out to either one of us.
And just to piggyback off of that, while we're still in this workshop, it's important for us to hear the feedback from all of you, whether it's a comment, a question, a concern, because this is how we gather our information. So of course, if you don't remember it right now, feel free to send an email. But we really want to hear from you and your input. Anybody else have any questions or comments or thoughts?
Think about it, raise your hand. I'll keep going.
And I know we have, I'm sorry, we have somebody on the phone as well. If that person has a comment, of course, we're reminded that you can just unmute yourself via phone and ask that question or comment. And if not, then Kirsten will, like you said, move on.
Move on. I'll let you keep thinking about it. Don't feel you can't interrupt me also. So this set of questions, there's 5 questions up on the screen, is about coordinated service. So we're asking, is a coordinated system an option for your region? If you have a coordinated system, do you have some lessons learned? If you have a coordinated system, what were the barriers to get your model up and running? Were there services you hoped you could provide but cannot? And then what are some other challenges preventing more coordination in your region? So I think for Atlanta, well, just like across the entire state, it's complicated. Um, there's a lot of transit providers in Atlanta. They do talk to one another. They do try to coordinate as much as they can. I think, Cobb, Link, Gwinnett County Transit, and MARTA are really trying hard to ensure seamless transfers between their systems. And in fact, Cobb and Gwinnett both accept MARTA's fare, the Breeze card. So they are trying and doing a pretty good job of coordinating from a fare perspective and transfers, but their service areas are still very much separated. And then, of course, you've got Douglas County, that provides service within the county. They connect to Cobb County, and then they also provide direct connections into Atlanta. But they do not have as many transfers with MARTA and are not on the same fare. So I know this is something that ATL is kind of focused on. But any other thoughts you have on trying to coordinate the public transit in Metro Atlanta? And then alternatively, any thoughts, questions, or comments you may have on coordinating more of the human services? I understand that ARC is looking at doing a human services transportation plan fairly soon. So if you have any ideas about what that's going to look like, we would love to hear those.
Hey, Kirsten, looks like Jordan has her hand up again. Jordan, ask your question.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It's not really a question. It's more of a comment, and I tried to put it in the chat, and it won't let me for some reason.
Okay.
But one thing that I think we're facing too within the coordinated systems is when you're talking about DHS and DCS, we have like a 3 days prior booking requirement too. So that is a thing. I think it might be beneficial for coordination purposes to transition to more of a micro transit model, just to not only increase the availability, but the reliability of the services, to provide individuals that
that's their only access to transit with a more consistent, and flexible travel system.
I think that's a key term right there, flexibility.
Yes, and then when we also talk about, medical appointments and things of that nature, I think there's a definite need in transit to implement other activities to improve overall quality of life. For example, mental health services, recreational activities, such as going to places of worship or places where they're going to have consistent community access. That's something that we find too, is that basic medical necessities, yes, they allow an individual to survive, but not necessarily thrive in those conditions.
So if I hear you correctly, rather than transportation, just be focused on those medical appointments, providing that transportation to other community activities, like you said, whether it's a place of worship, or maybe to a community center to attend events, things like that.
Absolutely. And then I think too, one of the pluses with like a micro transit model would be that it would be accessible for those aging and disability population, but it wouldn't be limited to those populations. So I feel like those more fully encourage complete integration within community versus like the models that are currently in place. They typically are grouping individuals within those populations together, but not giving them access to the community as a whole.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great comment.
And also, please let me know if I talk too much.
No, we appreciate it. We want all of the feedback. The more feedback you all provide, the better it's going to make this. And this is going to directly influence, like Matt said, the projects, the programs, the policies that we're going to come up with, and ultimately, recommend as a part of this study. So we want those recommendations to be based off of your input, and less off of, we want to include the quantitative data, but we really think, the feedback and the qualitative data from the surveys and what you're saying in these workshops are really going to directly influence, what we ultimately come up with. So I love these ideas. Thank you.
We've
All
got
right.
another one from Sydney with a question. Go ahead with your question, Sydney.
And not really a question, just a comment. This is Sydney, ARC. Hey, Kirsten. Yeah, you mentioned before, we're working on our coordinated HST plan. We have a scope almost ready, but we're still in the early stages, but we're definitely look forward to talking to you guys further. I've talked to Matthew, and actually he told me about this meeting, but we look forward to talking to you, and this has been very helpful, sort of seeing the approach you guys are using, but we'll definitely talk, and I'm glad to be.
Great. When do you hope to get that project kicked off?
As soon as I can get it done.
Okay, that's fair.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. That has a couple other questions. Again, just to kind of get you thinking about it, brainstorming. And we heard some of this during the survey. So again, if you have a chance to take the survey, please pass the survey along. We want this type of input, especially, well, both from the provider and the writer standpoint. But what other needs are out there for rural and human services? Anything outside of your service area or gaps in service, we understand that there's not enough funding to meet the demand. So that's certainly a need. But what other needs are you? And we talked about the cost of the rider, preventing higher ridership. The privatized transit is substantially higher than these third party um, transportation um, transportation providers like Uber and Lyft. But Uber and Lyft don't have the vehicles to be accessible to everybody. Um, So anything about the cost of the rider being too high and, how do we balance that? Any operating or administrative needs? We talked about staffing shortages, um, training needs, like you finding that, you can't retain staff because they're not receiving the training that they desire or that they need to do their job successfully. Um, and then, kind of this last question, if you had $1 million and you could spend it on rural and human services transportation, where would you spend it? And Jordan, I think you had some great suggestions on how that could be spent. It could go into more microtransit models to reduce the booking requirement time. Could also go towards providing transportation to more activities outside of just medical. So again, using that microtransit that's accessible to all, but available to aging and disabled populations to integrate everybody into their community. But how else would you want to spend $1 million? So these are just kind of open-ended questions. Again, think about it. If you come up with something, have some thoughts. We'll be taking your comments and questions until March 4th, which is 2 weeks from this Friday. So yeah, so I'll kind of leave it there. If anybody has anything else they'd like to add today. And if not, I will turn it back over to Matt to kind of wrap things up for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kirsten. To review our schedule, and one more time, we are working on the existing conditions assessment and the alternatives analysis now, and we'll start the development of the draft final report in the coming months. We are targeting July for publishing the draft final report on our website for that public comment period. Once again, I want to thank you so much for your participation in today's workshop. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me with any other questions or comments on the information we shared today. Also, we ask that you please complete our survey, whether you are a provider of RHST services or rider on those services. We want to hear from you. If you're on the phone, you can find the surveys at www.gdot.ga.gov/transit, and my email is mawilson@dot.ga.gov. And we do ask that you send any questions by March 4th so we have time to respond. Again, thank you so much for your time this morning, and please contact us with any questions you may have. Thank you so much.